Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider, discussing the dismal state of human rights and individual liberties in occupied and annexed Kashmir. A statement by UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on Jammu and Kashmir at Human Rights Council reads, and I quote, "I'm deeply concerned about the impact of recent actions by the government of India on the human rights of Kashmiris, including restrictions on internet communications and peaceful assembly, and the detention of local political leaders and activists. I have appealed particularly to India to ease the current lockdowns or curfews to ensure people's access to basic remedies and that all due process rights are respected for those who have been detained. It is important that the people of Kashmir are consulted and engaged in any decision-making processes that have an impact on their future," unquote. The UN High Commissioner's concerns and calls are consistent with the position taken by the UN system vis-à-vis the human rights situation in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, including the continuing restrictions and crackdown on fundamental rights and freedoms of the Kashmiri people. Meanwhile, in an op-ed for Hindustan Times, an Indian newspaper, Hasib Drabu, a former finance minister in the occupied state of Jammu and Kashmir, says, and I quote, "The development carrot is again being dangled to dampen the pain and anguish caused by the political stick," unquote. Drabu has been and remains part of the system that tried to give India's occupation a modicum of legitimacy. In fact, according to some reports, he left Mehbooba Mufti's People's Democratic Party because he wanted a higher political niche for himself by aligning directly with the Bharatiya Janata Party. Meanwhile, the government of Pakistan has been expressing fear that India is planning some false flag operation to stage manage a conflict with Pakistan and to support its argument that its current lockdown is owed to fear of attacks by groups sponsored by Pakistan. To discuss the situation in occupied Kashmir, whether the development carrot can actually work and the situation on the ground, we are joined by Lieutenant General Waheed Arshad, the former Chief of General Staff of the Pakistan Army, Robert David Steele, who is a former US Marine Corps infantry officer and also worked at the Central Intelligence Agency and has long experience of espionage operations, and Ruwa Shah, who is a political analyst, a Kashmiri based in Istanbul. Let me begin in reverse and taking advantage of Mr. Steele's experience. Mr. Steele, can you give us some sense of false flag operations? There's generally a sense, especially in the liberal enclave, that all of this is Hollywood stuff and it doesn't really happen. Does it really happen?
Well, yes, false flags really happen. I ran a false flag for the Central Intelligence Agency. A false flag is essentially not what it appears. Israel is a master of false flag operations, from the USS Liberty to 9/11. And Israel is very closely embedded in the India government. So if India does a false flag, which is an attack that it blames on Pakistan, but is actually done by India or Israel or others, paid others, then I believe that India will have been advised by Israel in doing this false flag event. Very real, and people do die.
Okay. You talked about USS Liberty. Back in 2001, and I think I probably got hold of that book in 2002 by James Bamford called Body of Secrets, and one of the cases that he discusses is the USS Liberty. Can you just walk us through, jog our memory about what happened there?
Israel attacked a U.S. naval vessel that was listening to the atrocities that it was committing in the camps against the Palestinians and others. And it decided to sink the ship. It may have actually decided to sink the ship with the approval of President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was a participant in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The USS Liberty was attacked by Israel. It was attacked by Israeli jets. NSA, my friend Bill Binney from NSA, and I have discussed this many times. We have the Israelis on the air saying they see the American flag, let's kill her, and then they use filthy language. One Israeli officer refused to attack when he saw the American flag, and he was subsequently put in prison. Israel invented modern terrorism, both to destroy and genocide the Palestinians, and then to get its own way in the United States and France and elsewhere. Israel is the absolute heart of false flag terrorism around the world, and certainly in India.
Mr. Steele, given your view of how Israel operates, I'm assuming that you're not particularly popular with the Israeli lobby in the U.S. But let me go back to something that you said about JFK's assassination. Lots of people would say that this is a conspiracy theory. If you say the spoor goes back to President Johnson.
Well, let me point out to you that apart from being a former spy with multiple advanced degrees, I'm also the top nonfiction reviewer in the English language in the world. With over 2,000 nonfiction reviews, I've just published a post that provides them all in a sortable table. And I am looking at over 15 books on the Kennedy assassination. This was done by a combination of New York money, Texas energy, the arms industry, and the Israelis who were very angry at John F. Kennedy, who was going to force the Israeli lobbyists to register as agents of a foreign power. They're still not registered today. And he was also going to stop the Israeli theft of the nuclear triggers. Arnon Milchan, who was the Israeli nuclear trigger guy, was in Dallas with Yitzhak Rabin to witness the JFK assassination. This is one false flag event that was done by CIA under Allen Dulles. It was not done by the Zionists, but they were present as observers and engaged complicit participants.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Robert David Steele talking to us. General Arshad, sir, leaving aside the Johnson bit of it, here's someone who says that he actually ran a false flag operation for CIA. We also know that the Indians have done false flag operations in occupied Kashmir. Chatir Singh Pura is one such. So, as a former Chief of General Staff, I'm sure you're privy to reports that refer to these false flag operations. So, for our viewers, not just outside in Pakistan, but also in Pakistan, give us a sense of how this plays out.
False flags, Indians are not new to false flags. I mean, they've been doing it, like you mentioned, Chatir Singh Pura. I strongly believe Pulwama was also a false flag. Because after Pulwama, actually nothing happened. There were no investigations, nothing. The issue died right there because it meant for a particular strategic purpose, and that purpose was served.
So are you saying, so the boy who committed the act, are you saying that he was given the task by the Indian intelligence, or are you saying that the Indian intelligence allowed him to carry out and created the situation in which he
could be both? I mean, he was, according to Indian media, press, he was under Indian custody 2 years prior to the Pulwama thing, was released once again, taken captive. So he's under Indian security forces. I mean, you can have a false flag, call it a false flag by motivating a person to his sense of motivation. He wouldn't know what he's doing, whether he's doing it for his own, benefit or benefit of his own cause, or is he being played by somebody because he's doing whatever he is doing for the larger purpose for which he is fighting. I mean, there are very intelligent methods of sort of doing that. TTP has been doing it in Pakistan for so many many years. So it's basically what we need to understand is that false flag is not just off the cuff incident taking place. There's a very clear thought and strategy behind it. What is India trying to achieve from a false flag if it does that? And as you rightly mentioned in your opening remarks, I think it's a very clear strategy, a very clever strategy to pin the whole thing, whatever is happening in Indian occupied Kashmir, to move it away from the human rights, genocide and ethnic cleansing issue,
and lockdown and communications
to an issue which is of Pakistan's making. I mean, this is a very clever strategy which they are playing, and they've been doing it for the last more than 1 year. Only people, I think we all didn't read the right signals, but they've been doing it. And this is the only way they can sort of, ward away the international pressure which is now growing, especially in terms of human rights, like the Human Rights the statement. And the statement is very significant that apart from human rights, it is also mentioning that whatever happens to Kashmir has to be from the perspective of the voice of the Kashmiris themselves, whatever they want. So in a way, the Human Rights Conference also reiterated the UN Security Council's resolutions. That is, the Kashmiris who have to decide what is going to happen to them.
So one type of false flag can be where you use the motivation of someone without that person's actual knowledge of why this is being done. Because
that's how the intelligence game is played.
Yes, absolutely. So the one who is steering that has a completely different motive.
Absolutely.
And second, as in the case of Chazisangpura, where the Akhwanis were used to kill the Sikhs, I think if I remember correctly, about 3 days before Clinton was to visit India. But let me go to Ruwa on this. Ruwa, I just quoted something from what Hasib Drabu wrote. Now, it's very interesting because Drabu obviously has a background which is certainly not that of any separatist or a freedom fighter, but he has been part of the system. Now, if he is writing this, then one thing is clear, that he doesn't believe that this strategy is working, the development carrot. And B, obviously, is probably also pining for some kind of, job with any new dispensation. What's your take on that?
Whether it's Drabu or it's any other mainstream politician in Kashmir, I think they have lost the ground completely in Kashmir, and they are being seen as the reason that whatever has happened in the backdrop of Article 370, they are being seen as the reason for it. So I don't think whatever Drabu says, writes now makes any sense or has any bias in Kashmir, for that matter, for any other mainstream politician who has ever sworn by the Indian Constitution. Not only have they lost the ground, I think they have also lost the grace to face the people of Kashmir. So maybe he's trying to rebuild his relationships with the Indian mainstream, New Delhi, but I'm sure it has no bias in Kashmir. And this is the Kashmiri people saying themselves right now.
Okay, so I was talking to, I talked to lots of Kashmiri activists, and one sense was that these people are probably kept rather comfortably, and they're not detained in any cells or anything. It's probably in one of the guest houses or something. And the sense was that they are saying whatever they're saying currently, essentially to sort of keep some kind of relevance, but are also playing in the hands of the BJP government, which would at some point want them to come back and begin some kind of political process. Is that, do you also share that sense?
I think they have also, they don't have a lot of space to keep all those prisoners now, because every prison is full of, first, the legit leaders who have been fighting. The main prisons are full of them. Now, whether Mehbooba Mufti, Umar Abdullah, or those mainstream leaders have been put in guest houses or in the Central Conventional Center or any other places, these are just, this is just an eyewash to show people that this action is against everybody. And also to make sure that there is no reaction from them. Even if there would have been any reaction from them, there would have been nobody to support that on the ground of Kashmir. I don't know if there is any leniency, or because the reports are not clear. I mean, there are some reports coming out from Kashmir, but it's not clear. And relatives of those mainstream leaders have been saying that they have faced a lot of difficulties visiting their, visiting those leaders and everybody. I would like to ask them about the families of prisoners who have been in prisons like Tihar jail or like any other harsh jails in India, not only since a few days, but for the last so many years. People have lost the count of years of the time that their people have been kept in prisons. There are thousands and thousands of political prisoners across the prisons in India, and they are suffering.
Which
the families are suffering.
Which reminds me, Ruwa, I know you've always had the grace not to talk about your own father, But since we're talking about arrests and all that, and your father has been imprisoned now, I think, for over a year, probably. So, what are the charges against him? And so, how? Okay, 2 years. So, what are the charges against him, and how does this work in occupied Kashmir? I mean, this whole arrest and detention business.
I see the arrest of my father, who is a leader of the Hurriyat Conference, and 7 other people who were arrested with him 2 years ago by the National Investigative Agency of India. They call it the terror funding case. So the basic allegation is that Pakistan is giving money, and they are taking the money and they're giving the money to stone pelters and making them pelt stone at the armed forces. This is the main allegation. And the case goes to Hafiz Saeed and Asiya Andrabi, and everybody has been named in the charge sheet, which is 13,000 pages. And the 13,000 pages, I have read the charge sheet, every page of the charge sheet myself. And I think I have the eligibility to say that there is absolutely nothing in the charge sheet. The charges are about Facebook posts, about the messages that comes in the groups that you are in on WhatsApp. I mean, how many groups do you have on WhatsApp, and what kind of stuff do you receive on that WhatsApp group? And for people who are as aged as my father, who is 60, who is not even technologically so advanced, he doesn't even know what the allegations are. I mean, they're not clear. They are just like, you have liked this page is in support of Lashkar-e-Taiba.
Absolutely, I hear you. Thank you so much for speaking with us. This is just one of the cases. Ruwa's father is the son of Sayyid Ali Gilani, and he's been, incarcerated now for 2 years. So, give me a sense, Haider, of how we have gone about it. Do you think that so far what we have tried to do is effective, or is there something more that we need to do?
So much going on within the country and so much going on outside the country in terms of in Afghanistan, FATF, and a lot of our options are strategically we have very limited options. Second is that the leadership in Kashmir, which they are put in detention centers or guest rooms or whatever, the point was made, they can't afford to sort of in this environment, even if when they are left out or they are released, to be seen to be towing the BJP line. The environment is such. The freedom movement is actually now in the hands of the youth.
Yeah.
So the leadership for their own political future will never be able to take a line which is seen to be towing or sort of favoring something which the BJP's development, strategy is trying to portray, and for the betterment of Kashmir in the long run and so on and so forth. I don't think that's going to happen.
What we are witnessing on the ground right now is, of course, there is the space to deployment ratio of the Indian security forces, almost like, there's 1 soldier for 6 people. Initially, it used to be like 1 soldier for 8 people or something. So it's a total clampdown. But whenever they soften it, immediately there's a reaction.
That's exactly why they are trying to. There is fears of false flag. There is fears of something happening along the line of control, because one, it will divert attention from the actual issue which is happening inside the Indian occupied Kashmir. Second, and more worrisome and more important, is that once the line of control becomes hot because of false flag or a strike or raid or something, it's going to escalate, because obviously it's going to have some response. And when it escalates, my take is that the Indians' strategic thinking is that when it escalates, the international players jump in. They will jump in not because of what is happening inside the Indian occupied Kashmir. They'll jump in to make sure that the line of control comes back to peace. And whatever is happening in Indian occupied Kashmir is happening. Let's make this line of control as a sort of de facto border between the two countries. Whatever the Indians have should be with them. They've already...
But that doesn't solve the problem of total alienation on the other side.
Exactly. I mean, this is because to win over the Kashmiris, the Indians have been trying for 70 years.
Absolutely.
They don't have anything to show for it. So what that they're going to do is they exactly know that given this development carrot, which they've been doing for the last 10 years also, and the same generation turned against them, which was being fed this development carrot for the last 10 years, including education, jobs. They're all coming back from the mainland India to occupied Kashmir. So they exactly know that this development carrot is not going to appease the Kashmiris. They have nothing else to show. So how will they appease the Kashmiris? So they have to, having annexed the territory, so they want to divert the strategic attention, the international attention to an issue which has always been a fallback position of the Indians of line of control as a de facto border and both countries, and to get rid of the United Nations Security Council
So
resolution.
give me a sense of how this plays out in terms of the Pakistan Army's responses. Like right now, what would the army be doing? They would be keeping an eye on the line of control. They'd be getting intel from what's happening on the other side. They would be looking at various contingencies, responses. Is that how it works out?
Yes, I mean, the army would be looking at two broad aspects. One is that there is obviously a lot of deployment along the line of control. There has been extra deployment, and they have the intelligence. They exactly know who's deployed where. There are additional forces which are not meant
In terms of the order of battle of the
yes,
Indian Army.
there are additional forces which are not actually meant for counterinsurgency. They are just there.
Correct.
And that could result into raids. That could result into small tactical actions. That could be there as a follow-up of a false flag operation taking place, and those troops being used for a raid or a strike, both the land forces as well as the air force. So when the army is looking at it, the army obviously plans for response given the threat.
Correct.
And various contingencies will be played out, like there could be raids, there could be strikes by, tactical strikes, could be by the Air Force. What is going to happen after that? If Pakistan has to respond along a line of control, where should they respond? What are going to be the effects of that response? All these things would have been now played out, and everything would be
Would we
in place.
need to move troops from the western border to sort of beef up, reinforce?
I think for the time being, whatever troops we have along the eastern border and extra troops we have are sufficient to meet the present threat across the line of control. But in case it escalates and you don't know what is going to happen, because it's easy to say that you will do escalation control, but then other dynamics, larger dynamics come into play.
Absolutely.
So when it escalates, we'll have no choice but to move troops from the western border.
So you also talked about the aerial platforms. I remember when you were the CGS, Pakistan Army was also doing these exercises, in collusion with the Air Force, HIMARS, and the Azmeno 1, 2, and 3, which was supposed to validate various concepts. So the Air Force is now completely, in terms of planning and integration, there with the Pakistan Army.
Absolutely, I think there's been excellent cooperation between the Air Force and the Army. In terms of operational responses, peacetime integration, there's total integration. And post-Pulwama strike was one example.
Correct.
Where, there was this immediate response, which was a national response in close coordination between the Air Force and the Army. And I think nobody should have any doubt, especially the Indians, that there's going to be lack of information or lack of planning or lack of thought. I think everybody is ready. Everybody knows what to do. I mean, personally, I think Indians would be stupid to take such a step.
Absolutely. You mentioned Afghanistan. We want to come to Afghanistan. We'll take a short break and return to discuss Afghanistan and the decision by President Trump to call off the year-long talks with the Taliban. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Following an attack in Kabul that killed, among others, a US serviceman, President Donald Trump told the media that the talks with the Taliban are dead. He said this on Monday, and he told reporters they're dead, referring to negotiations with the armed group, adding that he was still thinking about troop withdrawal in the country. The next day, the Taliban pledged to continue fighting against US troops. Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid said Washington would regret turning its back on talks. We had two ways to end occupation in Afghanistan. One was jihad and fighting. The other was talks and negotiations, Mujahid said. If Trump wants to stop talks, we will take the first way and they will soon regret it. Meanwhile, Afghanistan is gearing up for presidential elections. Taliban are opposed to the exercise and have warned people to stay away from voting. The vote could see much violence given that the US has disengaged itself from the Taliban. What are we looking at? To discuss the situation, we are joined by Jonathan Schroden. He has been with CNA since 2003. and looks at Afghanistan, has also been deployed to Afghanistan. And we also have Mr. Bharath Gopalaswamy, who is a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, joins us from Washington. And we also have with us Lieutenant General Waheed Arshad, former Chief of General Staff of the Pakistan Army. Let me begin with Dr. Schroden here. Dr. Schroden, what are we looking at really? I mean, when President Trump says the talks are dead, does he mean that's the absolute end of it? Or does that mean that, there is going to be a hiatus, but at some point the two sides could get back at the table together?
Yeah, I would be surprised if it means that they're forever dead. I think there's broad recognition inside of DC that the only way for the U.S. to get its troops out and still protect its national interests in Afghanistan is via some form of negotiated settlement with the Taliban. So I do think that's still the preferred path over the long run. The question is, with this latest hiccup, how many months or how many weeks or months will go by before they're able to restart those negotiations, and on what terms will they have to come back to the Taliban to get them to rejoin the talks? Okay,
there was a sense when, it was said that this was a kind of impulsive decision when President Trump said that he's going to talk to the Taliban. And there was also criticism saying, well, you say that we're going to talk to the Taliban and also say that we are withdrawing and we want to put an end to this war, so that gives a leverage to the Taliban. Now people are saying that just at the moment when, it was one turn away, the settlement for the first phase, there was an attack, and there have been attacks previously also. So what was so different about this attack? Was it the killing of the US servicemen, which once again got President Trump to impulsively say, well, the talks are dead? What is your sense?
Well, if you take the president's tweet at its word, it was the killing of the U.S. service member, which was the 16th one so far in Afghanistan, the highest total since 2015, that led Trump to call off these talks. And, he is sensitive, I think, to the number of U.S. casualties. Even if the number is small, I think they still resonate with him as the president of the American people. But there's also been a lot of reporting that's come out since his tweet storm on Saturday that seems to indicate that he was hoping to personally broker a much grander agreement than what had been agreed to so far by his representative, Ambassador Khalilzad, and the Taliban during their talks in Doha. Some people were saying that the president was hoping to, potentially arrange a sort of global resolution of the entire war itself. And so obviously, a summit arranged on about a week's notice with such grand ambitions probably was not a feasible, event to try and pull off in one fell swoop, no matter what the terms were.
Absolutely. Mr. Gopalaswamy, what is your sense of why the sudden thing? Of course, as Dr. Schroden said, Trump's tweets sort of indicated that it was the killing of the U.S. servicemen. But here's the thing, and, perhaps it does resonate with him. The fact is that there were bigger issues involved here. And he was so close to actually getting this done. How do you read this?
Well, I don't think a single event or a single thing sometimes, it most likely, in my mind, serves as a catalyst. I think probably President Trump, and we're all in the speculation zone out here because I do not know how Trump thinks, or I have never met him, nor I've interacted with him. But at the same time, looking at the data points, there has been violence. The Taliban, you talked about, there is inconsistency from the U.S. side, but there is also an inconsistency from the Taliban side because they've been engaging on one hand on the talks and also constantly have not slowed down on their violence per se. So, so Trump, I'm sure Trump and his closest watchers and his closest advisors are looking at this violence. And there is also a debate amongst the strategic community in Washington and elsewhere in the world that has constantly pointed out to this factor. And I'm sure at some level, this must have percolated to Trump's ears as well. So you look at that and you're coming close to something and you're looking at that and you see an attack again. And if I were in Trump's shoes, I'd be like, you know what, this is not worth it. This is something not right. And in some sense, it is the right thing to just call it off for now. And I also agree with my colleague who said that, yes, dead doesn't mean forever dead. And we do not know, while we do not know what the timelines are, we also do not know the mechanics, the modalities, and what are the other conditions.
Mr. Gopalaswamy, we know, if we go by the negotiations theory, it's the US that has called off the talks. Now, unless in this interim, if we assume that there will be talks at some point, unless the US actually gets an upper hand on the ground, if it comes back to the talks, it will have further strengthened the Taliban hand. That's very, very clear. So I think that is a risk to take. It's a pretty risky hand if I assume, which I'm not prepared to, frankly, that it was a well thought out thing and not an impulsive knee-jerk reaction to the killing of the US servicemen.
Well, I'm not even going there. What I'm telling you is dead doesn't necessarily mean dead. And we don't know what the timeline for that, whatever the dead to turn alive. And, I was about to say, we do not know what the mechanics and the modalities are. And we do not know what the conditions that might force each of the party to the table. So I'm saying there are so many variables out there that need to fall in place before anybody can return to the table.
Absolutely.
In some sense, I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a wicked situation. Thank you so much. That was Bharath Gopalaswamy speaking with us. General Arshad sir, how do you look at this? It came very close. Then there was an attack. My point is that there have been attacks throughout this year-long process. Now to actually sort of ignore the broader picture and just settle for a sudden thing about the US servicemen getting killed doesn't appear to me to be very smart.
Yes, I fully agree with you. I don't think it's very smart at all. I think it's something which is going to have very long-term effects if they don't start talks again, because, it's a stupid thing to do. You've taken 1 year of constant negotiations off and on. A lot of hard work has been done to shape the environment, to prepare the grounds for where they had reached. And there was an agreement on the table. It was initial, actually. They were in 2 phases. And my take is that I think the second phase was to be announced by President Trump himself at Camp David, that the Taliban have agreed to a partial ceasefire between the US, ISAF and Taliban. And intra-Afghan dialogue would have been announced because Ashraf Ghani was supposed to be there. Otherwise, why would he be there?
Correct.
So when all this was done and Taliban had agreed on that, to walk away from those talks on the basis of one incident, whereas more than 20 attacks have taken place during the course, these negotiations for the last year and a half, with greater losses actually.
Yeah.
And so I think there is more to what meets the eye. I'm not privy to whatever the US internal dynamics at that level are, but I think looking at sacking of the National Security Advisor, as well as the statements coming out of Washington, also indicate that there has been a lot of pushback within the American establishment on the terms of the agreement itself, because would have been and from the Afghans also, it would have been a ceasefire between the US and the Taliban. There was not to be any ceasefire between the Taliban and the Afghan National Security Forces.
But the Taliban had made it very clear.
Yes.
And they had said that this is going to be part of the second phase of negotiations.
So I think they should have gone ahead in looking at the importance of stability in Afghanistan. But I think now everybody is going to wait for the presidential elections and then see how things go from there. But I'll be surprised if the
presidential elections in Afghanistan. But okay, in the meantime, we're also joined by Hashim Wahdatyar, who's director at the Institute of current world affairs. Mr. Wahdatyar, we're just trying to figure out how and why did President Trump suddenly decide to disengage and call off not just the talks but also the meeting at Camp David? What is your take on this?
Thank you very much. The peace talks in Afghanistan with the Taliban is having a direct link with the presidential elections in the United States. President Trump needs to do big things in order to tell to the people of the United States to vote for him, including talking to North Korea, Afghanistan, Syria, and many more. But that did not turn out positive. And the Taliban leaders were invited to Washington, D.C., and they say that we will not come to Washington, D.C. unless the agreement is inked. One. Second, September 11 was coming here in the United States, September 11, 2019, and the President of the United States has to say something about his achievements in Afghanistan that he did not have. So it was not about the U.S. soldiers killing in Kabul a few days before was one U.S. soldier, but because 2 months before there were 4 American soldiers killed in Bagram of Kabul by the Taliban, but the peace talks continued in Qatar. A month before, 2 Americans were killed in Panjwai of Kandahar, but the peace talks in Qatar continued. So it was not about that. We do understand that civilian casualties and also the military casualties are going down in Kabul. It does not have anything with that. The second thing that I can tell you is that the peace talks will resume very soon, and because there are other countries that they will intervene. China will intervene, Pakistan will intervene, Qatar will intervene to resume the peace talks. But the important thing that we all need to understand is that who are we talking with? The Taliban? Will the Taliban bring peace to Afghanistan? No. How you deal with the Islamic State in Afghanistan? They are rapidly expanding. If you talk with Taliban and bring them to the negotiation table or form a government with them, you have to pay the price, you have to give the sacrifices. But at the end of the day, how you deal with the 20 other terrorist groups in Afghanistan? So
Mr. Wahdatyar, I'm a little confused here now. You saying that talks will resume. You've also said that the reason the talks were called off is not because a U.S. serviceman was killed, because those incidents have happened previously also while the talks went on. But then you have posited the question of who are you talking to? The Taliban. If you do that, will they bring peace to Afghanistan? And you have answered in the negative. So what exactly are you saying? I mean, given the situation, it's not just about what is desirable, but what is doable. So what exactly is doable here?
Well, first of all, let me clarify. The situation is that the United States will go back and talk to the Taliban. So that is the situation.
Okay.
My understanding is that talking to the Taliban will not bring a sustainable peace to Afghanistan. Okay. Because the situation that Trump will go back or the United States will go back and talk to the Taliban, that is the reality and the fact. Okay, that is the decision of the United States and policy. Look, the Trump tweet is not a decision. Trump has changed his view on Afghanistan a number of times. During the campaign, he said that he will fully withdraw his forces from Afghanistan. He will not pay any penny to Afghanistan because he wants to build with those money the roads of Washington, D.C. in the United States. But after he won the election, he sent like thousands of Americans to Afghanistan against what he used to say. And now he's stopping. And a few months ago, he said that we are talking to the Taliban. Let's see what that will bring in. But now they say we're not talking to the Taliban who are terrorists. Why were involved like 1 year later?
Okay, let me punt this across to Dr. Schroden. Dr. Schroden, you heard what Mr. Wahdatyar is saying. He's obviously, what he's saying informs of the complexity or wickedness, shall I say, of the situation in Afghanistan. But do you agree with him?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a very complex situation. And really, you never know what's going to happen. I mean, tomorrow, much less next week. I would say that the conditions that we're staring at right now are, as you quoted earlier from the spokesman from the Taliban, they are intent on ramping up their violence, their level of attacks. I think in order to try and prove that they're in the right and to try and gain additional leverage for talks if and when they restart. President Trump, as well as the commander of U.S. Central Command, who was in Afghanistan a couple of days ago, have both commented publicly that the U.S. intends to do the same in the near future, which is to say ramp up their level of operational tempo and their level of aggressiveness against the Taliban. So in the immediate future, I think you're likely to see an increase in violence in Afghanistan, unfortunately. And then you've got the Afghan elections, the presidential elections, which appear like they're going to happen now on September 28th. And that's going to throw another sort of monkey wrench into the process here. If President Ghani wins in the first round, that might actually be a good thing in terms of keeping the negotiations going and giving him a new mandate in which to negotiate from. But if it turns into another messy affair, as it did in 2014, that could really set the talks back, both in terms of the timeline, but also in terms of the Afghan government's negotiating position.
Absolutely, because here's what we are looking at. One is, of course, as you rightly mentioned, and I also mentioned in my opening, that violence on the Taliban side is going to ramp up because they've already said that they don't want these presidential elections. They've asked the Afghan people to stay away from the vote. But also, those who form the current power configuration in one way or the other, whether the current government and its allies or the opposition and its allies, if the presidential elections are marred by the kind of corruption charges that we saw previously, then that will have its own impact on the situation, and it could get really messy.
Yeah, I think that's the worst case outcome that the U.S. and especially Ambassador Khalilzad and Ambassador John Bass, who's the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, that's the worst case scenario that they've been trying to forestall for the last year. And they were sending very subtle messages and increasingly not so subtle over the last few months that the U.S. would prioritize the peace process over the holding of elections in Afghanistan if that was the choice that eventually came to be. And so they were really hopeful to get a deal by the 1st of September so that I think, they could sort of argue, offline with the Afghan government that the election should be postponed in order to allow for the intra-Afghan negotiations to get started. Now that the election is going to take place, that worst case scenario of a messy outcome is potentially back in play. Now, let's all hope that doesn't happen. It would be much, much better for the Afghan government and the Afghan people if the election goes well.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Thank you so much. That was Jonathan Schroden speaking with us. We're looking at a messy situation.
Yes, of course we are. There's going to increase violence both by Taliban as well as counter-reaction by the ISAF and Afghan National Security Forces. There's going to be increased activity by the Islamic State elements there, because they have gained a lot of strength. Then you have the TTP with their bases also in Afghanistan.
And apparently the TTP is linking up with the ISIS.
And so Pakistan is facing, sort of double jeopardy with the eastern border, sort of getting hot, and the western border also situation getting, hot in terms of whatever is going to happen inside Afghanistan.
And the linkages between the eastern border and the western border.
Absolutely. So I think we are looking at a grave situation given the situation now, because as you were saying, Dr. Schroden, the elections are probably going to take place now. And who knows what's going to happen, because there are a lot of groups fighting for those elections. It's not only Yasser
Absolutely,
Ghani.
And they are extremely inimical to each other. I just want to quickly go back to Mr. Wahdatyar before I wrap up. Mr. Wahdatyar, let's talk about the sort of political sort of rivalries and enmities that there are within the power configuration. Forget about the Taliban. How are you looking at that scene?
Well, look, Mr. Ejaz, the political disagreements are everywhere. It is in the United States, it's in Pakistan, everywhere. That's in Afghanistan as well. And that is the
but in Afghanistan, you've got satraps with their satrapies that don't really give much traction to the central government in Kabul. I mean, we saw that with Dostum and Atta and various other people. So it's more than just political rivalry.
Well, wherever Atta is, wherever Dostum is, they are not a threat to the security of Afghanistan anymore. That is part of the political process, and that is democratic process, and that Afghanistan should be proud of. That like in 15 to 18 years, they have turned like the big warlords are turning to be political figures now. So that's a very good step in the process in Afghanistan. Of course, we do have problems with the election systems. It cannot be conducted all over the country 100%. There cannot be technological and also remotes and IT tools that we can have like elections transparent all in every villages in Afghanistan. We will be facing those kind of problems during the elections. There will be demonstrations after elections, but it needs to be sustained.
Okay, it needs to be sustained. Thank you so much, Mr. Hashim Wahdatyar. So I have to wrap up, but I think Mr. Wahdatyar was trying to sort of play down the idea of rivalries, because rivalries is one thing. Clear sort of disobedience of orders of the central government is a completely different thing. You know, Dostum and Atta and various others, they have their fiefdoms.
Of course, even
they control their
even the chief executive Abdullah and President Ashraf Ghani don't see eye to eye on issues of governance within, not even within Afghanistan, but also within Kabul. So and with the candidates, it's very clear that there are open divisions within the central government which are vying for power.
Yeah.
And if you add people like Dostum and Atta and the Taliban factor and the IS factor, it's a messy situation, to say the least.
But how prepared are we for this kind of ramped up violence in Afghanistan? Because there could be a likely spillover into our areas.
I think the increase in violence, one, Pakistan has been a favorite beating stick of everyone. When there is more violence in Afghanistan, the Afghans start blaming Pakistan. The US starts blaming Pakistan, that they have a lot of influence on Taliban, and Taliban have ramped up their violence, so it must be Pakistan must do this, Pakistan must do that. That is one factor. Second is, on ground situation, we might see more violence coming across the western border through...
And absolutely, I'm happy you said this, because if I were an Indian planner, I would hot up the line of control.
It's an excellent opportunity.
The line of control, and since I have connections with the NDS, I will also make sure that there are more fire raids and assaults within FATA, erstwhile FATA, so that Pakistan cannot really move troops if it wants.
The aim is to keep Pakistan busy on both the fronts. This is one of the ideal situations they have.
This is one of the ideal situations. So we are looking at a complex situation, both on the eastern and the western borders. This is all for today. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.